Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, all. Good morning. So in this session, we're going to cover two things. I'll just wait until... Thank you. So we'll cover two things in this session. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the government's fiscal plans, its objective now legally binding to eliminate the deficit in this Parliament. And then in the second half of the session, two other IFS researchers, Andrew Hood and Helen Miller, will join, and they'll talk a bit about their careers at IFS, how they got into IFS, what they've worked on at IFS, what it's like working here, because part of the goal of today is to encourage good people to come and apply to work here. So I should say I'm Carl Emmerson, I'm Deputy Director here, and I work on public finances, which is why I'll be presenting this initial piece. So if we go back to before the general election, back last March, we see that in the UK the Treasury was forecasting a surplus for the government in 2018-19. So it was planning to collect more in tax and non-tax revenues than what it would be spending. And in the election campaign, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, clearly stated there's a balanced plan to clear the deficit by 2018. We will be running a surplus. So Treasury was forecasting a surplus and the Prime Minister was committed to doing it. Since the election, the government has passed a law which will require the government to achieve a surplus by 1920. Notice that's 1 year later than what the Prime Minister was talking about before the election. And actually to maintain a budget surplus in every single year thereafter, with a caveat that says that this rule will be suspended if economic growth at any point falls below 1% over a year. So if at any point the economy is 1% lower than what it was, smaller than what it was a year before, the rule is suspended. So a clear desire to get back to surplus, but then also to maintain that surplus. So I'm going to talk about whether the government's on course to do this, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and how the government is planning to bring this about. What does it mean for taxes and for spending? Clearly, getting rid of the deficit involves some combination of higher taxes or lower public spending. So, as a share of national income, this graph shows the deficit since 2007-8. You can see that the financial crisis and associated recession led to the deficit increasing significantly from 2.7% of GDP to over 10% of national income. And the coalition government between 2010 and 2014-15 halved the deficit as a share of GDP. Interestingly, they did not halve it by 2013-14, which is what the last Labour government had legislated as an objective. So on taking office, the coalition got rid of that law, set their own fiscal objectives, and then actually reduced the deficit less quickly than what Alistair Darling had been claiming Labour would have done. Going forwards, the latest forecast published in December, alongside the spending review, implied a deficit continuing to fall over this Parliament until we reach a surplus in 2019-20 of 0.5% of GDP. So in terms of the pain, if you like, of deficit reduction, you could say, well, at least as of last March, we'd halved the deficit, government wants to eliminate it, we're kind of halfway there in terms of the tax rises and spending cuts that would be needed if indeed you do want to get to an overall budget surplus. It's worth highlighting two things. This graph shows the deficit as a share of GDP in every year in the UK since the late 1940s. You can see that this 10% of GDP deficit that we managed in 2009-10 was the largest by some distance since the Second World War. So the financial crisis and associated recession caused a very large deficit in the UK by historical standards, surpassing the peak seen previously in the early 1990s recession and the mid-1970s. So a very large deficit that the government's been trying to tackle. The other thing you can see is that if we do get to budget surplus, these are pretty rare events. We had them in the early years of the new Labour government when the economic growth was strong and the government was squeezing spending on public services. We had one in the height of the boom in the 1980s. We achieved some in the mid-1960s and some straight after the end of the Second World War. But achieving a deficit is pretty rare. A surplus is pretty rare. We don't often have them. Achieving one and then maintaining it for a sustained period of time, well, that's just not what the UK has done over the last 60 years or so. The surpluses that we've had have been pretty short-lived. What's the government's motivation for wanting to get us to surplus? Well, they put a lot of weight on the fact that public sector net debt is high. So the stock of debt, when measured as a share of GDP, looks pretty high by historical standards. So all that borrowing that we've done over the last few years and over the next couple of years has been adding to the stock of debt. It's forecast to be peaking around now at about 80% of GDP, and you can see that we haven't had debt that high since 1967. So UK government debt is high by recent historical standards. If you go further back and you stretch history a lot further, you can see actually the UK government has had higher levels of debt for sustained periods of time. So between 1830 and 1870, between 1916 and 17 and the mid-1960s. So debt of 80% of GDP, it's high by recent historical standards. Certainly the UK government has had higher debt for long periods in the past. So that raises the question, well, is it a good idea to have a budget surplus? What's the economics of this? Do we think it's good for the government to collect more in tax and non-tax revenues than what it spends? Well, all else equal, if you achieve a budget surplus, you're going to reduce debt in cash terms, you're going to reduce debt as a share of GDP more quickly. And if you do bring about lower debt, that brings about two potential advantages. Firstly, you're going to spend less on servicing that debt. Your debt interest costs will be lower. That means less of your national income each year needs to be spent on debt interest payments, and you can spend more of it on things you'd like to have, like boosting household incomes or investing it in public services. The other reason to want to get debt down might be a desire to have more scope to increase it if something bad comes along. We just had a financial crisis come along. The stock of debt as a share of GDP, I should show you here, increased from about just below 40% of GDP to 80% of GDP. So bad shock came along, UK government added 40% of GDP to its debt stock. You might want to have the scope to add a lot of debt if a bad shock occurs. We can see that the Second World War came along, UK government added a large amount to its debt stock. So you might want to have low debt so you can increase it rapidly if something comes along that means you want to increase it.
The 1.5 trillion, or are you still talking about the deficit?
This is the stock of debt. Well, it's about 80% of GDP is the conventional measure. GDP is about 1.8 trillion, so it's around a trillion, just over £1 trillion. It is. There are different measures. This is the total amount of debt that the government has. This measure here, net of short-term financial assets that they are holding. So any cash reserves they hold. It's not net of any other longer-term assets they hold. And it also excludes the debts of the temporarily, or should be temporarily nationalised financial organisations, things like Lloyds Banking Group. So that's an organisation which has significant assets, it also has significant debts. The debts are not included here because it's intended to be a temporary measure. If you included the debts, you get a much bigger measure for debt. Their debts are sizable relative to the UK economy, but of course they have significant assets like the mortgages they hold, but they're not short-term financial assets, they're long-term ones.
So the debt was for the amount of £1 trillion?
In excess of £1 trillion. But I think it's more natural to measure it as the size of the economy, and it's important to think that what matters is how big your debt is as a share of your GDP, how much you're having to spend out of your national income to service that debt. Having a large debt but having a larger economy is clearly not a problem. So there are a couple of reasons why you might want low debt, but there are several reasons why we might think governments will want to borrow. Perhaps most obviously is investment spending. If households want to make an investment, if you want to, for example, purchase a house, you don't generally save up enough money to buy the house outright. Individuals often go and get a mortgage to purchase that investment. Equivalently, firms often borrow in order to carry out investments. So similarly, you might think governments, if they're faced with an opportunity to carry out an investment that involves a big upfront cost but will deliver significant benefits into the future, they might think it's reasonable to borrow to do that. Another way to think this through is supposing the motivation for reducing debt is because we're trying to make sure that future generations are not burdened by high levels of debt interest spending. Well, they might be quite pleased if they don't have high debt interest spending, but they presumably will not be pleased if that's brought about by just not investing much in the country. And it means that we've ended up with depreciating the quality of our roads, for example. So if you've got a government and it's trying to make an investment decision, it's got an upfront cost. It knows that the benefits of that investment are going to accrue not just to the current generation but future ones. You might think it's pretty reasonable to borrow the money and for future generations to share in the cost of financing that. And if they don't, the risk is clearly the current generation will say, well, we're not going to do that investment. Why would we want to do it if we have to meet the full cost of doing it? It's not worth it to us, even if it would be worth it to subsequent generations. In some periods, there'll be an argument for borrowing in order to carry out output stabilisation, to try and smooth the ups and downs of the economic cycle, and in particular to do that when in periods when you think that monetary policy is unable to adjust. A lot of the debates over the last few years have been about whether fiscal policy has been too tight, given that monetary policy is unable to loosen, or might be unable to loosen further, given that interest rates are so low. Shocks come along. If a bad shock hits you, you might not want to adjust immediately to that. Even if you accept that this shock has happened and you've got a deficit, you might not want to straight away put up taxes or cut spending to deal with that. You might want to ease in those tax rises or spending cuts to adjust to the new fiscal position. So that would point to borrowing for a period. So supposing we get to 2019-20, we have a surplus. What happens if 6 months into the next financial year something happens and some revenues start to dry up? Do we really think the government should put up taxes midway through the year to make sure we get a budget surplus in that year? Or should we smooth it out a bit and perhaps adjust more slowly? That's related to forecast errors. The world won't turn out as we expect. Even if we think we're going to get a surplus in each year for the next 5 years, forecasting the size of the economy, forecasting what tax receipts will be, forecasting what spending will be is difficult. Clearly, if we get a positive forecast error and there's a bigger surplus, we'll end up banking that. Is it the case that every time we get a negative shock and things don't turn out quite as good, should we adjust immediately to that? And then finally, there's tax rate smoothing. We think that it's better to have kind of constant tax rates over time rather than tax rates that are adjusting up and down every single year. We think that the cost of taxes increases with the size of those taxes. So, for example, if you knew that you had an aging population, you might think it's good to put up taxes early in the face of that and smooth out the rise rather than have lower taxes for a bit and then put them up a lot. There may be situations where the reverse happens, where you think the public finances are going to strengthen in future. Supposing you knew that there was some big oil reserve about to be discovered in the UK in 10 years' time, rather than keep taxes higher for 10 years and then drop them, you might think it's better to drop them a little bit now and not as much in 10 years' time, to smooth it out over time. That may be a more efficient way to run your fiscal policy, but it clearly involves running deficits in some years potentially. So some advantages to having low debt, but actually in some periods at least it seems pretty clear there are reasons why governments might want to borrow. Of course, some of this is covered by the government's rule. They've explicitly said if growth drops below 1%, then borrowing is okay. So output stabilisation, I guess the Treasury would argue, well, if the economy it gets close to recession, growth of 1%, not a shrinking economy, we're still able to borrow. So there's a nod towards that justification implicit in the government's rule. There's less weight put on the other arguments relative to the government's desire to reduce debt.
How does the 1% rule work? Is it if they get a forecast it's going to fall below that? Or is it if they actually measure it?
Yeah.
Don't they always revise it?
It's anything. If the data at any point show the economy is now 1% below where it was a year ago, so that's kind of backwards looking. The ONS released some data, latest quarter, it's now 1% down, rule gets suspended. Or if the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent forecaster, says we think growth is going to be below 1% next year, the year after that, immediately the rule gets suspended. And that doesn't matter then if the GDP subsequently gets revised and all of a sudden growth wasn't below 1%, or if the OBR changes its mind about its forecast. The rule has been suspended and that's it. So if at any point it looks like it has been or is going to be 1%, below 1%. Okay, so this graph is showing tax receipts as a share of GDP in the line in yellow at the bottom. The orange line at the top is showing public spending as a share of GDP. So the difference between the two is the deficit. So you can see the financial crisis opening up this large gap between tax and spending. the largest deficit since the Second World War. You can also see that why did this deficit emerge? Well, part of the story is because tax fell as a share of GDP, but a bigger part of the story is because spending grew as a share of GDP. That's not because of the extra costs of debt interest spending or the extra cost of the unemployed. It's really because the amount we spend on schools, on hospitals, on other public services in cash terms had been set out pre-crisis. The economy turned out to be much smaller than we expected, and therefore spending on those public services were a much bigger share of the national cake. And you can see that the government's halving of the deficit over this period has been achieved really through a reduction in public spending as a share of GDP. So how are they planning to bring us back to surplus? Well, it's a combination of tax rises and further spending cuts. So you might like the idea of getting back to budget surplus, but you've then got to stomach the pain of these tax rises and these spending cuts to get there. So I'm now going to talk a bit about the mix that the government has gone for. So firstly, there are significant tax rises over the next few years. That might be a surprise to those who read the Conservative Party manifesto, which did not propose a net tax rise. Less of a surprise to those who've looked at the pattern of elections in the UK over the last 30 years, where the first year after an election often contains big tax rises being announced. So in the July 2015 budget, there was £16 billion worth of tax rises announced, £9 billion of tax cuts, so a net tax rise of about £6 billion. I've listed there the tax rises. And then back in November, there were no tax cuts, and there was tax rises worth another £7.5 billion. So we've had a significant set of announcements from the Chancellor about increasing tax since the election. Perhaps naturally he talks more about the tax cuts that he's announced rather than those tax increases. There's also been significant cuts to working age benefits being announced. The government is planning to take £12 billion off the welfare bill by the end of the Parliament. It's freezing the rates of most working age benefits. It's cutting universal credit, a benefit for working age low-income individuals, and it's implementing further cuts to housing benefit. So as a result, if it goes ahead with this plan, if you exclude spending on state pensions and you look at benefit spending as a share of GDP outside of state pensions, in 2020 that's forecast to reach its lowest level as a share of national income for 30 years. And we can look to see what that's going to do to household incomes. Tax rises and welfare cuts on average will squeeze household incomes. So on average we see households losing about 1.8% of their income as a result across the board, because you're putting up taxes and you're cutting benefits. We can also see how that varies across the income distribution, from the poorest tenth of households on the left up to the richest tenth of households on the right. And you can see the pattern is one where those in the bottom half of the income distribution are on average losing much more. That's because of the reliance on benefit cuts, which working age benefit cuts, where most working age benefit spending goes to people in the bottom half of the income distribution. So it's not really surprising when you cut that, you end up hurting individuals in that part of the distribution on average by more. So that's household incomes. The other part of the squeeze is through cutting public service spending. So I'm going to look now at what central government spends on the delivery of public services. Back before the last election, we carried out analysis of the Conservative Party manifesto and the Labour Party manifesto and set out what we thought the path of spending on public services could be, given our reading of those manifestos. So under the Conservative manifesto, we were suggesting that implied cuts through to 2018-19 before spending could start to grow again. Whereas under Labour, we were saying actually there was no need for cuts to meet their fiscal objectives, and spending growth would just be relatively low up to 2018-19 before being able to increase more quickly. So what's the government now planning to do? Well, it's planning to follow this blue path. So if you look at 2019-20, you can see, well, actually they're cutting spending by about the same amount over that 4-year period to what their manifesto implied, or at least what we thought their manifesto implied. But it's much more steady path rather than having this deep cut and then tick back up. They've smoothed that out. And in fact, if you looked in the period up to 2018-19, you could say, well, what they're planning to do looks more like sort of 2/3 of what Labour was planning to do and 1/3 of what the Conservative Party manifesto implied. So, and it looks, how much are we squeezing here? Well, this is 2% out of public service public services over a 4-year period. So you might think, well, that's not very much. Take 2% out over a 4-year period. So on average, it's not very much over this period, but I think there's two things to remember. Firstly, it comes on top of deep cuts in the last Parliament, and secondly, it's not equal across all public services. So some areas are getting cut by a lot more than others. So 2% cumulative cut over the period to 2019-20. That brings the total cut up to 12% since 2010-11. If we just look at day-to-day spending, we see that that's going to be cut by 3% over the next 4 years, again bringing the cumulative cut up to 12%. Capital spending, we see a very different pattern. Over this Parliament, it's set to actually be increased by 5%, and it's been cut over the last Parliament. So far, Mr Osborne has overseen a cut of 17%, but the increase over this Parliament will mean by 2019-20 the cut will be 13%. So there's a difference between capital spending and current spending. That already clearly has an implication for different departments. Some services are capital intensive, like transport. Some public services more reliant on day-to-day spending. Just looking at the day-to-day spending, so I just said that the government was looking to take 3% out of day-to-day budgets over a 4-year period. That's a cut of £10 billion. And here's a list of government departments. This is central government spending on those departments. You could, of course, choose to cut everybody by 3%, but the government's not chosen to do that. Increases in spending for international development, for health, for defence, actually an increase in spending for schools budgets, a small cut to education outside of the schools budget. So there's some protected areas of government. That meant that, and those protected areas are over half of what government does. I mean, in terms of central government spending on public services, health, defence and schools are a very, very large slice, over the majority of spending on public services. So all of a sudden, because these are going up, the cut elsewhere is not 10 billion but 16 billion, the average cut not 3% but 18%. And this is how they've chosen to allocate those cuts. Increases in the Cabinet Office budget, that's spending on security services, cuts elsewhere, and some of those cuts extremely deep. So you can see DEFRA, Justice, Department for Work and Pensions, Treasury and HMRC, all facing cuts of around 15% over the next 4 years. Big cut to the transport budget, but I should remind you the capital part of their budget is going up. But clearly this is going to potentially put pressure on things like fares for buses and trains, etc. And then a very big cut to local government. What that means is it's grants from central government to local authorities that are being cut very deeply. What central government is saying is actually local councils can make that up with revenue from business rates and with council tax. So this is not their only source of spending. The government's going to be handing them less in grant, but giving them greater powers over their business rate revenue and their council tax. And Treasury estimates suggest that on average local authority spending will be cut by about 7%. So the figure here overstates the extent to which this will feed through into a cut to their overall budgets. So that's the cuts over the next 4 years, but we can add to that the cuts these departments have already experienced. And you can see that by and large, the departments that are going to get cut quite hard over this Parliament are those departments that got cut hard over the last Parliament. Health and schools were protected in the last Parliament. It was areas such as BIS, such as DEFRA, such as Justice, such as the Home Office that got deep cuts in the last Parliament. So the cuts we're seeing over this Parliament coming on top of those that were already experienced. And if you're a department like the Ministry of Justice, responsible for prisons, in 2019-20 you're going to see your budget some 45% down on what level it was at in 2010-11. So some extremely deep cuts there, partly because of the squeeze to overall spending and partly because of the choice the government's making to increase spending on some areas such as the NHS. So to conclude, the government has a fiscal mandate now which will require it to deliver a budget surplus from 2019-20 onwards, and with the caveat that that rule will get suspended if growth drops below 1% per year. There are advantages to reducing the ratio of debt to GDP, but there are certainly some reasons in favour of government borrowing in at least some years. The latest plans imply that the fiscal mandate will be met. It will be met through a combination of significant tax rises, cuts to working age welfare, and also cuts to day-to-day spending on departments. Those cuts are less quick, less deep than they were over the last Parliament, but there are some areas of government which are facing very, very deep cuts, such as the day-to-day budget of the Transport Department and the day-to-day spending on justice. Thank you. So that's me done on the public finances. I don't know if there are any further questions.
You said that you think the government's going to get down to sort of a surplus by, is it 1920?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for reasons I don't need to go into, I personally don't think they're going to do that. But I think that we're going to have. I personally don't think they're going to do it because their cuts in lots of ways are quite counterproductive. And I don't think they'll do it. But I just wondered if I can just drill down a little bit more as to why they will do it, because they're sort of cutting, here and there sort of thing.
Right. So I think that. So I'm not saying they will do it. I'm saying that they are forecasting they will do it. There is certainly a whole load of risks around that. There's risks in terms of just what happens in the economy, although of course they have this caveat that if growth drops, the rule gets suspended. There are risks on the tax side. For example, they're committed to some further tax cuts in their manifesto, which are not yet in the plans, further cuts to income tax in particular. And there are clearly risks on the public service side. Now, will they deliver these plans to reduce the deficit? In large part will mean it comes down to will they be able to cut public service spending like they think. One reason to think they will is the evidence so far, in that over the last Parliament, in terms of day-to-day spending, departments on average overachieved the cuts that they were given. So far it seems to be the case that once departments are given a cut that they have to work to, they do that. They go away and they keep within budget, and if anything, they're overachieving. So evidence to date suggests actually you could be quite confident. Reasons to think actually it's going to get harder is, well, firstly, these cuts are now on top of other cuts. So what you cut first is presumably the waste, the inefficient stuff, the stuff you kind of like to have, but it's low value. What you're left with is the stuff that you decided to keep in the last Parliament, or the stuff that's just too hard to tackle. Big squeeze in the last Parliament on spending was achieved through squeezing public sector pay, and the government wants to continue that trick. That may have been easier in the last Parliament when wages in the private sector were not growing very fast. I think in this Parliament it might be trickier to squeeze pay with private sector wages, hopefully at least, rising. So that will become more difficult. And then there's just the obvious pressure on public services that the population's growing in size, the population is aging, putting pressures on things like the NHS, on social care budgets. So I certainly think it's going to be difficult. Let's see if I had another slide. I mean, clearly the government has not reduced the deficit as much as it hoped over the last 5 years. It wanted to be in a better position now than what it was predicting back in 2010. And that story was very much about growth underperforming, the economy not delivering as much tax revenue as it hoped, not being big enough to deliver the tax revenue. It wasn't really about failure on the public spending side.
Can we look at your tax and spend chart related to that?
Yeah.
Because just to test your kind of general knowledge here, there are surpluses sort of in 70, I think it was, in 80 and 90, there were 3 years of surpluses.
Surplus here, yeah.
And just before that, you've got this tremendous drop in spend each stage. And all this is associated each time with a crisis, actually, with a sort of collapsing growth, isn't it? In the early 70s, early 80s, early 90s.
So this surplus here is because the economy was growing really quite fast, pulling spending down as a share of GDP. The government was also squeezing spending through not cutting what we now think of as government, but cutting spending on what was part of government then. So cutting the housing budget quite deeply. It was cutting the defence budget, actually, because the Cold War had ended. And it was selling off industries, some of which were so they'd been spending by those industries, which was moved out of the government to the private sector. So this was a period that's why this spending is going down. And a big part of, as I say, strong economic growth, which delivered that surplus. And then recession hit, and it meant that the government taxes fell further, but spending grew.
The same sort of thing, well, in 1990, another surplus.
In here, there was a surplus. Essentially, here it was much more about, there was strong growth in the latter years of the 20th century, dot-com boom in the US. That was boosting revenues. The financial sector was doing very well. But also the incoming Labour government had signed up to 2-year spending plans on public services that the outgoing Conservative government had set. The outgoing Conservative government Chancellor, Ken Clarke, said that he wouldn't have kept to them. So they signed up to tight spending plans at a time when the economy was growing. So that delivered this cut to spending in here. They also put up taxes in their first budget and brought about that surplus.
Are there any estimates for like GDP comparing, with the cuts against if they hadn't happened? Either, previously under the coalition, but then also estimates for the future? Because this is just a personal view that cuts now would be harmful to growth and actually would increase debt rather than spending out.
So the closest thing to that, I think, is the National Institute for Economic and Social Research have done estimates of growth under the outgoing Labour government's plans in 2010 and the GDP under the Conservative plan, which involved bigger tax rises, welfare cuts and public service cuts. So it's kind of deficit reduction versus more aggressive deficit reduction. It's not a don't do anything versus what the coalition did. And there they say, yes, GDP was reduced by the action taken by the last government, but it's not as big as you would have thought. The Labour government was planning quite a lot of austerity already. As I said, they were planning to try and halve the deficit by 2013-14, which is something the coalition actually missed. But the impact on GDP that they have is not so great. The OBR has also produced estimates of how big they think the impact on GDP has been. So they're taking that into account in their forecast. It's not that they're saying that when you do this austerity you don't get a reduction in GDP. But there's obviously a lot of disagreement about what the right multipliers are and whether the OBR's ones are appropriate size or whether they should be much, much bigger. I think that's where the dispute really is.
In the chart that outlined the effect on different departments of the courts,
Mm-hmm.
national development spending increased by 34% on net.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of spending does that constitute, and what reasons is the government providing to justify such a?
So that is overseas aid spending. It's not a particularly large budget, but it's one that's been increased a lot, and it's because of a cross-party agreement that we should be spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid, which has been a kind of UN recommended level since about 1950, but most countries don't achieve it. There was an agreement around 2005 amongst major economies that we would all move towards this, and the UK has delivered on that promise. And because we were spending, I think, about 0.2, 0.3% of GDP, we had to increase spending pretty rapidly to get it up to the 0.7. So it's aid programs around in Africa, for example. Okay, one final question.
What was the relative balance between spending cuts and tax rises of the last Labour government, had they been in office after 2010?
So the Alistair Darling plan was something like 70% spending cuts, 30% tax rises. Maybe 2/3 spending cuts, 1/3 tax rises, something like that.
And what actually occurred?
About 80-20. So they're both planning bigger spending cuts and tax rises, but the coalition and the Conservatives are doing more on the spending side than what Darling was implying. And I mean, obviously, what you think the right mix is going to depend really about what you think the right size of state is. But one justification was, well, if you thought we were at the level you wanted pre-crisis, you would have to do more on the spending side than you did on the tax side to get back to that. So this increase in the size of the state here was deliberate. The Labour government were deliberately increasing taxes to pay for spending rises. This increase in the size of the state was not deliberate. It was because of the financial crisis and recession. It was not planned upon. Okay, so we should move on now to the next session about working at IFS.